Hi, my name is Dave Warren. I'm the Deputy Director of the International Public Sector Accounting Standards Board. With me today is Eamon DeLeo, a manager of the IPSASB staff. Welcome to the Introduction to Exposure Draft 78, Property, Plant, and Equipment webcast. This webcast will provide an overview of the key proposals of ED 78. You may also find helpful the at-a-glance summary of ED 78, which is available on the IPSASB website, www.ipsasb.org. Eamon, over to you, and why don't you kick us off and tell us what we're talking about today?
Thank you, Dave. Today, our webcast will cover the history of Exposure Draft 78, followed by the main features of ED 78. And at the end of the webcast, we will also cover the next steps for this project. Dave, may you please provide us with the brief history of ED 78?
Thanks, Eamon. So this next slide is an important slide in reminding our listeners that ED 78 was released as part of a package of 4 exposure drafts. Now, these exposure drafts were released as a package because the proposals in each of the exposure drafts have impacts on each of the other ones. And as a result, the IPSASB wanted to ensure that its constituents had the ability to consider the proposals holistically. Starting on the far left, we have Exposure Draft 76, updates to the conceptual framework. And this exposure draft proposes changes and updates to Chapter 7 of the conceptual framework, which focuses on measurement. The focus of these updates is to better align the conceptual framework with proposals in ED 77 measurement and the IPSAS suite of standards in general. In the middle, we have Exposure Draft 77 measurement. The purpose of this exposure draft is to better provide constituents the ability to apply the measurement bases that are commonly applied in IPSAS in practice. So as a result, what this exposure draft does is provides a significant amount of guidance on how to apply the measurement bases in practice. Next, moving to the top right, we have Exposure Draft 78. And this is obviously where we'll spend most of our time in this webcast. ED 78, Property, Plant, and Equipment, takes into account the proposals of measurement and other aspects, which I will speak to on the next slide, and pulls those together and updates IPSAS 17, Property, Plant, and Equipment, so that all the components of various projects are taken into account. And again, our constituents can consider those holistically. On the bottom right, Exposure Draft 79, non-current assets held for sale and discontinued operations. This project was identified as part of the measurement project as a gap in the IPSASB's literature that can be filled through a narrow scope alignment project with the equivalent IFRS standard. Again, these 4 exposure drafts were issued as a package in order for constituents to consider the proposals holistically. And as a result, all 4 exposure drafts were given the same exposure period. ED 77, 78, and 79 do include consequential amendments, and that is the link to the broader suite of IPSAS. Now, I talked about various components of ED 78 and different projects that all linked into ED 78 and resulted in this update to IPSAS 17, Property, Plant, and Equipment. And the first project that I want to speak of is Heritage Assets. This is a project that's been ongoing for a number of years, and as it progressed, the changes that were being proposed to IPSAS 17 were becoming more and more significant. This is true of our second bullet as well, Infrastructure Assets, another project that's been ongoing for a number of years. And what the IPSASB noted with these 2 projects is that as the amendments to IPSAS 17 were growing, it was better to consider these projects holistically along with the measurement project, all 3 of which would have significant impacts on IPSAS 17, Property, Plant, and Equipment, and consider these 3 projects together or holistically so that our constituents could also consider them as such and make their comments on a holistic level so that they could be better considered and better resolved by the IPSASB going forward. First, focusing on the Heritage Project, this is a project that, like I said, has been under progress for a number of years now. And this was really started to address several long-standing concerns. In 2017, a consultation paper was issued, and in this consultation paper, one of the main preliminary views that was put forward is that where heritage assets meet the definition of an asset and the recognition criteria, they should be recognized as such. Our constituents strongly supported that proposal, and as a result, the IPSASB made the decision in late 2019, early 2020, that where heritage assets meet the definition of property, plant, and equipment, they should be accounted for as such. So the first step in the heritage project that made amendments to IPSAS 17 and resulted in the updated ED 78 was to remove the heritage scope exclusion from IPSAS 17 that currently exists. The removal of this scope exclusion now allows for heritage assets that meet the definition of property, plant, and equipment to be accounted for within the scope of ED 78, property, plant, and equipment. What's important about this change is because the IPSASB decided that in some cases heritage assets do meet the definition of property, plant, and equipment, the IPSASB decided not to define heritage assets. However, what they did focus on was providing additional guidance to identify specific characteristics of heritage assets that made them difficult to account for in practice. In this case, the two characteristics that were identified were irreplaceability and having restrictions in long and sometimes indefinite useful lives. And a good example of this would be a historic work of art or a historic monument. In both cases, if they're ruined or destroyed in any way, they're irreplaceable. So they're not easy to reproduce or put back in place for the public to use in some regard. The second point on restrictions or long or indefinite useful lives, in both the cases of the monuments or the work of art, these can be, if maintained, they can be useful for decades or centuries, and they don't have the same useful life that general operating assets have. So as a result, that was another significant characteristic of heritage assets that can have an impact on the accounting for them in practice. And these two characteristics can have an impact on control, recognition, measurement, and as a result, they're identified, and how these characteristics impact the accounting is really fleshed out in ED 78. The next proposal relates to additional disclosure requirements for unrecognized heritage assets. In this case, the IPSASB discussed in certain circumstances, heritage assets may go unrecognized because it may be very difficult to come up with a measurement for them. In these cases where a measurement is not practicable, the IPSASB has proposed that the disclosure of these assets be made as a part of the normal property, plant, and equipment disclosures. As a result, this will allow users of the financial statements to have a better picture of the assets available to the entity that holds them. And then finally, other useful guidance was also included. This mainly relates to the development of implementation guidance and illustrative examples related to measurement, depreciation, control, challenging aspects of accounting for heritage assets. Eamon, why don't you take over and walk us through infrastructure assets and the key proposals that relate to those?
Now let us look at the main features or key proposals of ED 78 regarding infrastructure. The infrastructure project seeks to address the challenges identified by preparers when applying IPSAS 17 principles to account for infrastructure assets. ED 78 proposes that infrastructure assets are property, plant, and equipment, and therefore the principles in ED 78 on accounting for property, plant, and equipment should also apply to infrastructure assets. The IPSASB decided not to define infrastructure assets, but proposes that infrastructure assets are characterized as networks or systems that have long useful lives. For example, a water system or network comprise assets such as dams, pipelines, tunnels, canals, terminal reservoirs, tanks, wells, pumps, and treatment plants. These characteristics distinguish infrastructure assets from general property, plant, and equipment and give rise to particular accounting issues. These particular accounting issues have been addressed in ED 78. ED 78 also proposes additional application guidance implementation guidance, and illustrative examples to clarify the existing principles of accounting for infrastructure assets related to the use of information in asset management plans for financial reporting as a useful source of input when accounting for items of property, plant, and equipment, including infrastructure assets. The IPSAS-B acknowledged that public sector entities have asset management plans that facilitate the proper management of an item of property, plant, equipment over its life cycle. ED 78 also proposes other useful guidance for control of land under or over infrastructure assets, measurement of land under or over infrastructure assets, under maintenance of assets, and parts of infrastructure assets. Dave, may you please provide us with the key proposals regarding measurement?
Thanks, Ayman. So there's two proposals that I wanted to go through as they relate to measurement, and these both flow from ED 77. So going back to one of the first slides I went through in that puzzle, this is really how ED 77 and ED 78 fit together. So the first change I wanted to go through relates to the update in the definition of fair value. So when the consultation paper for measurement was released, one of the proposals was that the definition of fair value that was used often throughout the IPSAS suite of literature be migrated from the existing definition to a revised definition, which is based on the IFRS 13 definition in fair value measurement. And the main decision, or the main reason for this decision, is because the IPSASB took the view that where they're using using the same terminology with the same meaning, it should be defined the same way to ensure there's enhanced consistency and less confusion in practice. The IPSASB also reviewed its literature to determine whether the IFRS 13 definition of fair value was appropriate throughout. In the majority of cases, the IPSASB concluded that the definition of fair value in IFRS 13 was appropriate in its literature. And this was the case in ED 78, property, plant, and equipment. Now, even though this proposal coming out of the consultation paper received significant support from the IPSASB's constituents, one concern that was raised is fair value wasn't always appropriate in the public sector. So as a result, the IPSASB Senate spent a significant amount of time developing a public sector specific measurement basis, which they've called current operational value. Now, current operational value addresses significant concerns that were raised by constituents as they relate to fair value as defined in IFRS 13. And the major concern is that the IFRS 13 definition of fair value works very well for assets and liabilities that are held for their financial capacity, but it is more challenging to apply for those assets that are held for their operational capacity. And because there are significant assets held in the public sector that are held for their operational capacity, the IPSASB need to spend time to develop current operational value. And the reason why this has such a big impact on ED 78, property, plant, and equipment, is because property, plant, and equipment in several cases, or in most cases in the public sector, is held for its operational capacity. So these are assets that are held with service delivery objectives in mind. So as a result, this might be a water treatment plant or a sewage facility. They're not held to generate profits, they're held to deliver a public good or public service. So what current operational value does is it really focuses on measuring assets in their current use. So in contrast to fair value, where you are required to measure the assets in their highest and best use, under current operational value, like I said, you use their current use. An example of this that was discussed a number of times is a school in a major city center. So a school in a major city center measured under fair value may give a very high value because the asset itself could be used for other purposes. So it could be turned from a school into an office complex, or generate rents that are higher than the school in some other way. Whereas current operational value, because it's focusing on the current use, really focuses on the use of the asset to the entity that is currently holding or operating that asset. So I'll stop there, and Eamon, maybe you can start to wrap us up.
Thank you, Dave. As for the next steps, ED 78 was issued in April 2021. We encourage you to respond to the ED by October 25, 2021, which is the deadline for comments. The IPSAS-B would greatly appreciate and benefit from different points of view as it progresses towards finalizing the standard. The IPSAS-B will consider a first review of responses received at a December 2021 meeting and will look to issue an IPSAS on property, plant and equipment once it has completed this process. Depending on the responses received, the IPSAS-B's target is to approve the IPSAS on property, plant and equipment in September 2022. Thank you for viewing this webcast. For further information, please visit our webpage, www.ipsasb.org. From Dave and I thank you. Goodbye.